Today, the Supreme Court heard arguments in another pivotal voter ID case. Voting rights groups in Arizona have challenged the Proposition 200. It's a law requiring state residents to show proof of U.S. citizenship when they register to vote. They believe that the law unfairly targets minority voters. NBC News Justice correspondent Pete Williams covers the court and joins me now from the newsroom. Pete, tell me about the argument today and what's at stake here.
Well, what's at stake is this law. This is not the traditional voter ID law we've been talking so much about, which is voter ID at the polls. This is at the time of registration, and there's a clash between Arizona's law and the federal law, the motor voter law, which allows people to register either by walking in or mailing in a form or when they go to get a driver's license. Now, Arizona wants you to, on the federal form, you check a little form that says, yes, I'm a citizen and I do this under penalty of perjury. Arizona says that isn't enough. They want you to show some proof of citizenship, your driver's license number, some sort of other information. And the question is whether the state can do that or whether that violates the federal form and goes beyond what the federal law envisions for certainly federal elections. One of the justices said today, Samuel Alito, suppose somebody rides up on a bicycle looking 13, wearing a middle school T-shirt, carrying the school books, and says, I want to register to vote and I certify I'm old enough. Does the state have to register that person? And that's sort of what the court struggled with today, Andrea, which was, yes, we understand that there's this federal form, but what else can the state do to confirm this information? The opponents of the law say that this is intended mainly to discourage especially naturalized citizens from voting.
And Pete, did you infer anything? I know it's always hard to judge, but did you infer anything from the way the justices were questioning the lawyers today as to which way they might be leaning?
Well, you know, we thought the big issue in this case was a constitutional one, a clash between the Constitution saying that states declare the time, place, and manner for holding elections, but also giving the federal government the power to overrule those laws. And the justice actually spent very little time on that and seemed to be more interested about how and why Arizona is using the specific tactic it is to challenge this law. So a one-word answer to your question is no. I couldn't tell.
Okay, thanks so much, Pete Williams. Joining us now here in our studio is Maria Teresa Comar from Voto Latino and Nita Perales who was one of the litigants actually in today's court argument. So Pete Williams was just saying that there was no way to really infer from the court argument. You were sitting at the council table there. What was your impression today?
Well, I thought that the justices really focused in on the key issues before the court. Does the federal law, which mandates a simple postcard for voter registration, override the Arizona law, which requires something very, very different, which is the attachment of personal documents like birth certificates and copies of passports? And so the court was right where I think the issue is today, and asked some very difficult questions of Arizona about whether state law must yield.
But Nina, is there a possibility that they could then say, just judging from what Justice Alito asked, you know, could some teenage person, you know, looking like a middle schooler, ride up on his bicycle and ask to be registered to vote and say, yes, I'm a citizen? Could they then challenge the federal law and say that that's not adequate? I mean, how much leeway do they have based on this argument?
Well, the leeway really is provided under the Constitution, and when Congress does step in and choose to regulate very specifically, as it has with the National Voter Registration Act, states must yield to that. With respect to the hypothetical involving the boy on the bicycle, I think what that perhaps doesn't recognize is that all states take their voter registrants and run them through various databases to make sure that they are who they are, usually in driver's license and other databases. So the question is really what can be required of the applicant, of the individual at the time of registration. Congress says a simple postcard. This certainly leaves the states free to do whatever checking they want to do on their own.
Maria Teresa, how is this targeting minority and largely Latina voters?
Well,
what do you think Arizona was trying to do?
Well, I think fundamentally, basically, it's trying to claim that there's voter fraud where there isn't, right? So this is a law in search of a problem that definitely doesn't exist, and this has been done by numerous numerous, both nonpartisan groups. And what we find is that in a time when we should be modernizing our election system, when we should be including and be inclusive of individuals to participate in the democratic process, a law like Arizona basically hinders participation. And what I mean by that is that if you're a young person, the number one reason people in the United States don't register is that they think that the process is too complicated. So an organization like mine, we go into Arizona and we basically go to where the voter is and we register them to vote. Now, how many voters do you think are walking around with their birth certificates or with their naturalization
or even know where those papers are?
Or if you're a married woman, how many women have actually changed their birth certificates to reflect their married name? So it's an undue process. And again, it's almost as if these folks are talking two sides of the mouth, because all of these folks that are proposing this legislation all happen to be Republican state legislators. And at a time when the RNC today says that they want to spend $10 million for minority outreach, but at the same time prevent voter registration, which is the simplest form of civic participation in our country. And Andrea, this is something that even in a country like South Africa, where they have had a history of apartheid, they have higher voter registration numbers than the United States. So there's clearly a problem. And this state law is actually hindering our participation in the democratic process.
Nina, do you see this state law as just another example of the kind of voter suppression that was attempted in states around the country?
Well, the impact of the Arizona law is definitely to stop the future,
right.
Which is that it's preventing voter registration from tens of thousands of eligible U.S. citizens. The court record shows that over 31,000 people were rejected for voter registration in the first 2.5 years of the law. And they reflected broadly the demographics of Arizona. Most were not Latino. Most were born in the United States. So it's had a broad disenfranchising effect. And in that way, it's similar to other laws that prevent people from participating.
Maria Teresa, do you see other states trying to imitate Arizona, or will this test, if Arizona loses this test, will that put an end to this?
Well, you have states such as Georgia and Texas actually encouraging the passage of this law. And one of the folks, they actually helped file this law with the Supreme Court in support of it. So what my fearful is that if you actually look at these states that are actually supporting the Arizona law, not surprisingly, you have a boom in young voters, you have a boom in African-American voters, and a boom of Latino voters. So they're, instead of trying to engage this growing demographic, they're kind of scratching their heads like, again, we're trying to hold back the future, and let's actually make sure that these folks don't participate in our democracy. And that's not good for anyone, Andrea.
Maria Teresa, Nina, thank you very much. Big day for you with the Supreme Court argument. Thanks. And we hope you'll come.